The 4:15 out of Cheyenne came in on time for once, and Levi Stroud stood on the Sage Bluff platform with his hat in his hand and a photograph in his coat pocket gone soft at the corners. When the woman stepped down from the second car, he knew her face at once. The dark hair, the level brows, the small determined chin the photographer's light had caught just so. For a moment, the whole year of letters seemed to gather itself up and stand breathing in front of him. Then he began to notice the things the photograph had never shown him. Her gloves were mended at 2 fingers. She carried one carpet bag, and she carried it the way a woman carries the last thing she owns. Her eyes, when they found his, were wide and braced, the look a creature wears when it has decided to hold still for whatever is coming. "Mr. Stroud," she said, and stopped, and he watched her gather herself towards something that plainly cost her. And just then, the depot agent came hurrying up with a question about a trunk that did not exist, and the moment shut like a stove door. Levi Stroud would have the truth of her before the lamps were lit that evening. Sage Bluff would have it by Christmas week, in the churchyard, with the whole congregation looking on, and what Levi Stroud did in that churchyard would be told in 3 counties for 40 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Wagon Road ran north out of town along Lodgepole Creek, 6 miles of frozen ruts between banks of red willow, and for the first mile neither of them said a word. Levi drove with his collar turned up. The woman sat with the carpet bag on her knees like a passenger who expects to be put off at any moment. Twice he saw her draw breath to speak. Twice the breath went out of her with nothing in it. She had rehearsed this for 900 miles, through Illinois and across the whole brown width of Nebraska, and every version she had practiced came apart the moment the man beside her turned out to be real. With tired, kind eyes and a clean shave he had plainly given himself that morning in her honor. Her name was Esther Tabor, in Winterset, Iowa, where Rufus Tabor had kept a harness shop for 30 years. Everybody knew the Tabor twins, born 11 minutes apart in the fall of 1856, alike as 2 pins to look at, and no more alike than rain and dust in every other particular. Sylvie was the 11 minutes older, and had gone through life as though the head start entitled her to go first through every door after it. Sylvie laughed easily, danced better, and had been proposed to 4 times before she turned 20. Esther stitched harness at her father's bench, kept the accounts, and for the last 4 years had nursed Rufus Tabor through the long, slow business of dying. Sitting up in the room over the shop while the town slept, and the lamp burned itself down. It was Sylvie who answered the matrimonial notice, on a snowy February evening, for the pure lark of it. A rancher in Wyoming territory, 34 years of age, sound in health and property, wished correspondence with a woman of sense who was not afraid of distances. Sylvie wrote 1 letter, giggling at every line, and had a photograph made at the gallery in Des Moines with her hair done high. Then the answer came, and it was long and plain and serious, and at the bottom of it was a postscript in a boy's uphill hand, asking whether she could make molasses cookies and whether she was afraid of dogs. Sylvie read it once and yawned. "Write him back for me, Essie," she said, tossing it across the quilt. "You're the one with the words." So Esther wrote him back. She meant to do it once. She did it for 14 months, 22 letters, and somewhere around the 4th one she stopped writing as Sylvie and began writing the plain truth with her sister's name signed under it. She wrote about the smell of the harness shop, neat's foot oil, and new leather. She wrote about what a person thinks at 3 in the morning in a sick room, and about their mother's sourdough crock, still working after 19 years. And she answered every one of the boys' postscripts as gravely as if cookies and dogs were the 2 great questions of the age, which, she told him, they very nearly were. The letters that came back she read by lamplight in the sick room, some of them twice. Rufus Tabor died the 1st week of June. The bank took the shop and the house in August, and the 1st week of September, with her trunk already packed for Wyoming, Sylvie ran off to Davenport with a man named Latham, who traveled in parlor organs, leaving a note pinned to the railway ticket. "You always liked his letters better than I did anyway." 3 miles out of Sage Bluff, Esther made herself say it while the wagon was still moving, because she did not trust her courage to survive a stop. "Mr. Stroud, I have something to tell you, and I would rather tell it now than let you feed me first. I am not Sylvie. Sylvie is my twin sister. She married a Mr. Latham of Davenport in September. My name is Esther Tabor. The photograph you have is her. I came because you were owed the truth to your face, and because I mean to pay back the price of that ticket as soon as I can find work." Levi did not pull up. He drove on through the willow flats with his eyes on the horse's ears, and the silence went on long enough for a magpie to scold them from a fence post and give it up as wasted effort. When he finally spoke, he asked the one question she had not rehearsed an answer for. "Who wrote the letters?" "All of them but the first," she said. "The first was Sylvie." He said nothing at all for another half-mile. Then he said, "There's a room off the kitchen with a good stovepipe through it. Georgie and I have been batching it 3 years now, and the cooking has gone about how you'd expect. Work for wages until you feel square, and in town, we'll say the wedding is put off till after fall shipping, which is nobody's business and true besides. Past that I don't know yet. I won't pretend I do. That is more than fair," she said, when she could trust her voice. "It isn't charity," he said. "I've eaten my own biscuits." The ranch buildings came up out of the creek bottom at dusk. A log house with a lean-to kitchen, a sound barn, corrals, a windmill turning slow against a green winter sky. A boy of 13 came off the porch at a dead run with a speckled dog ahead of him, hauled up short at the wagon wheel, and stood beaming at her with his ears going red. "You look just like your picture," Georgie Stroud said. Esther looked away up the darkening creek so the boy would not see her face, and said that supper would be along inside the hour if somebody would show her the kitchen. That night she lay in the little room off the kitchen, listening to the windmill clank and the enormous quiet underneath it, and she thought that she had told the truth and the sky had not fallen, and that tomorrow she would earn her bread in a stranger's house at the far edge of the world, and she slept better than she had since June. She took hold of that kitchen the way her father used to take hold of a rotted breechen strap, without ceremony and without asking its opinion. By the end of the first week the stove drew properly. The sourdough crock she had carried 900 miles in the carpet bag was working again on the warming shelf, and Georgie had quit inventing errands that carried him through the kitchen and had simply moved in, doing his lessons at the table while she worked. She put down eggs in water glass against the winter, rendered lard from the fall hogs, dug the last of the potatoes the frost had spared, and mended every sock in that house without being asked. And if her eyes were red some mornings, when she came out to light the stove, nobody was unkind enough to remark on it. In the second week the offside tug on the work harness let go at the buckle end, and Levi came into the kitchen looking for wire. Esther looked at the broken tug once, went to her bag, and came back with a wooden roll tied shut with a bootlace. Out of it came harness needles, and all, a lump of beeswax, and a hank of linen thread. She soaked the leather, skinned the 2 ends thin, laid the splice, and put a double row of saddler's stitching through it. Waxed ends crossing in the same hole from both sides, her hands moving with the settled certainty of a thing done 10,000 times. Levi turned the mended tug over twice in the lamplight. "Where did a person learn that?" "At my father's bench," she said. "I could stitch before I could sew. He worked that harness all winter, and the splice outlived the buckle." Georgie never doubted her for a moment, because as far as Georgie knew, she was the letter lady. And the letter lady she plainly was. "You said sulfur and lard for Pilot's ear," he told her the second evening, presenting the dog's healed ear for inspection like a certificate. It cleared up in 4 days. She had said exactly that, in the 11th letter, in answer to a postscript. She examined the ear with proper gravity, pronounced it healed clean, and said that Pilot had been brave about it, and Georgie glowed, and the dog, who understood tone if nothing else, beat his tail against the floor. On Sundays, they drove into the frame church and sat in the Stroud pew, and the congregation looked at her the way a small town looks at an unresolved question. She sang the alto line low and true. Old Mrs. Beecham, who sat one pew back and missed nothing on this earth, remarked to her daughter that whatever else might be uncertain about the Stroud place these days, the bread that had come from it for the harvest supper was not baked by any lively photograph. Town was another climate. At the Mercantile one Saturday, Mrs. Purcell ran her aground between the dry goods and the ribbon case. Mrs. Purcell was the minister's wife, and she had arranged the introduction through the Cheyenne Bureau herself, having a strong instinct for management and a settled conviction that every sound match in that county owed something to her hand. "We had looked for a wedding before the snow, Miss Tabor," she said, in a voice pitched to reach the Boyd girls over by the thread. "The cattle come first out here, I suppose. Though I will say, dear, you photographed livelier." Esther said the fall work had come first, and that she hoped Mrs. Purcell was keeping well and paid for her thread, and walked out with her back straight and her ears burning. The letters lived in a cedar box on the shelf above Levi's desk, tied up in blue string. One of them, though she did not know it yet, rode around in the breast pocket of his work coat, gone soft at the folds the same way the photograph had. One night in November, with Georgie asleep and the wind working at the northwest corner of the house, Levi sat turning his coffee cup a quarter turn at a time and said, without looking up, the sound a house makes when the sickness in it finally sleeps. It was half a sentence out of the 12th letter. Esther did not look up from the darning egg, like the house is afraid to believe it. She said, which was the other half? He nodded, slow, as a man nods when a suspicion is confirmed, and the suspicion was a hope. He never asked her to prove anything again. Later that month, she found $11 that the feed store had helped itself to, across 4 months of his arithmetic, and Levi rode in on a Tuesday and came home with the $11 and something around his mouth that in a less careful man would have been called a grin. The first hard snow came on the last night of November, and on the cold nights after that, a flat iron heated on the stove and wrapped in flannel found its way to the foot of her bed, and neither of them ever said one word about it. The second week of December, the bottom fell out of the thermometer, and on the worst night of it, past midnight, a fist hammered the kitchen door. It was Ray Tullis from the claim downstream, snow to his knees, no coat, a lantern shaking in his hand. The baby, he got out. Jane, she's strangling. The doctor's in Cheyenne and the missus sent me for your... He stopped there, having no word for what Esther was, and settled on for her. Esther was dressed and into the wagon in 10 minutes with the kettle, the camphor, and a crock of goose grease. The Tullis cabin was one room of lamplight and terror, and in the middle of it a baby of 10 months barking like a seal and fighting for every breath. Esther had the kettle roaring inside a quarter hour and a sheet tented over the rocker, and she sat inside that steam with Jane Tullis against her shoulder an hour at a stretch, and when the steam had done what steam could do, she bundled the child to the eyes and walked her up and down the porch in the knife-cold air until the crowing in her chest eased, and then carried her back into the steam and started over. All night, trading off with nobody, because there was nobody to trade with. In between, she kept Ada Tullis busy filling the kettle and trimming the lamp and warming flannels, and she talked the whole time, low and level, about Iowa, about sourdough, about nothing at all, because a frightened mother needs a voice to hold on to almost as much as a croupy child needs steam. Levi kept the stove in wood and stayed out of the way, and watching her through the sheet steam with the lamplight behind it, he understood, as a man understands weather, that the letters had been the smallest part of her. Toward 5 the cough broke loose and turned wet and ordinary, and by first light Jane Tullis was asleep with both fists over her head, breathing like anybody. At the door, Ray Tullis gripped Levi's hand hard enough to grind bone. "Your wife, God bless her," he said. Levi looked across the room at Esther, asleep sitting up with the baby still on her shoulder, and did not correct him. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The mail came up from Cheyenne on Tuesdays and Fridays, and the Friday before the 4th Sunday of Advent it brought 2 letters that mattered. The first was for Esther, forwarded twice, in Sylvie's slapdash hand. Mr. Latham's prospects in Davenport were bright. The winters there were sharp. Would Essie send along the good gray cloak with the rabbit trim, which had been left behind in the rush of things, and no hard feelings, she hoped. Esther read it twice by the stove, and what she felt was too braided a thing to give one name to. Grief and anger and a thin, unkillable fondness, all wound into the same skein, and underneath all of it the guilty knowledge that her sister's running off was the whole reason she was standing in a warm kitchen that smelled of bread she herself had baked. She folded the letter into her apron pocket and said nothing at supper. Twice that evening, she came near to handing it across the table, and twice she put it back. Levi knew the whole of the truth already, and still she found she wanted one more quiet week of the life she had not earned before anything else arrived to put a price on it. The second letter went to the parsonage. It came from the Cheyenne Matrimonial Bureau, regretting to inform Mrs. Purcell, whose kind interest in their service was so well valued, that the party contracted to Mr. L. Stroud of Sage Bluff, Miss S. Tabor of Winterset, Iowa, had married in that state in September, that the contract was therefore void, and that a refund of the placement fee was enclosed with the Bureau's compliments. Mrs. Purcell read it 3 times, and every reading enlarged it. She had vouched for that Bureau out of her own parlor. 2 other Sage Bluff men had paid fees on the strength of her word. And out at the Stroud place, eating at a bachelor's table these 10 weeks under the standing of a bride, sat a woman who, the arithmetic now insisted, could not be Miss S. Tabor at all. It did not once occur to Mrs. Purcell to ride out and ask. A fraud, in her experience, was a public matter and ought to be met where the public stood. She put the letter in her good black bag and waited for Sunday, feeling, as she waited, entirely righteous, which is the most comfortable feeling there is, and the most dangerous. The 4th Sunday of Advent came off bright and bitter, snow squeaking underfoot, and after the service the congregation lingered in the churchyard the way it did whenever the weather allowed visiting. Georgie was off showing the Tullis boys the dog. Levi stood by the wagon talking hay with the Reverend. Esther had a basket on her arm with a loaf in it for old Mrs. Beecham, and she was 2 steps from handing it over when Mrs. Purcell's voice came down the churchyard, pitched to Carrie. "Miss Tabor, before you go, I wonder if you would settle a small question for the congregation." Heads came around all down the yard. Mrs. Purcell advanced through the trampled snow with the black bag held out in front of her in both gloved hands. "We have all wondered when the wedding is to be, but I find this week there is a question that comes in front of that one." She drew out the letter and unfolded it without hurry, a woman with the floor and the facts. "This is from the Cheyenne Bureau. It informs me that Miss Sylvie Tabor of Winterset, Iowa, the lady contracted to Mr. Stroud, the lady whose photograph sat on my own mantel while I made the inquiries, was married in Iowa in September. To a Mr. Latham. She let that walk the length of the churchyard on its own legs. Sylvie Tabor is in Iowa, a married woman. So my question, dear, is a plain one. Who is standing in my churchyard wearing her face?" Nobody laughed. The cold ticked in the bare cottonwoods. Esther stood very still with the basket on her arm, and then she bent down and retied the muffler Georgie had let come loose at his throat, taking her time over the knot, and straightened up and looked at Mrs. Purcell with her chin level. "My name is Esther Tabor," she said. "Her twin," said Mrs. Purcell, and let the word do its own work in the cold air. "The copy, sent along when the original found a better offer. 10 weeks at that man's table under her sister's name. There is a word for that, and it is not a word I use on the Sabbath, so I will use the weekday one. Fraud. I vouched for this arrangement. Men in this congregation paid good fees on my word. If a woman can be shipped west under a false name like a crate of misdirected freight, then I want it spoken of in the open, and I want to hear from her own mouth what name she signed at the bottom of those letters. She's the one who wrote the letters." Georgie had come through the crowd with the dog at his knee, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and he kept going anyway. 13 years old and scarlet to the ears. All of them. She told me sulfur and lard for Pilot's ear, a year before she ever laid eyes on him. She knows what I asked about the sorrel mare, and what she answered back. Ask her anything out of those letters. Anything. In the quiet after that, Levi Stroud crossed the churchyard. He did not hurry. He came and stood beside Esther, and from the breast pocket of his good coat he took a letter gone soft at the folds, and he held it up where the whole yard could see it. "I sent for the woman who wrote these," he said. For the space of one long breath, nobody in that churchyard moved. Somewhere behind the church, a horse shifted its feet. "She came," Levi said. Mrs. Purcell rallied for one more. "You were deceived, Mr. Stroud. They sent you the wrong sister." Levi looked at her a moment, and around the churchyard, unhurried, and back. "I know exactly what was sent me," he said. "You'll notice I'm not complaining." Somebody over by the fence snorted, and the laugh went around low and warm, the laugh of a crowd that has just been let off a hook. Old Mrs. Beecham came across the snow, took Esther's free hand in both of hers, and said, to the yard at large, "Jane Tullis is sleeping through her nights on account of this woman. That is testimony enough for a weekday or a Sabbath, either one." Ray Tullis said, from the edge of the crowd, that he would put his name under that in ink any day of the week. The depot agent, who had carried her one carpet bag 10 steps on an October afternoon and been thanked for it like a lord, allowed that in 20 years of railroading, he had never once seen a swindler mend her own gloves. Even the Boyd girls, whose whispering had arranged the ribbon case could testify to, were looking at Mrs. Purcell now instead of at her. Levi turned to the Reverend. We'd like the church the Saturday after Christmas, if it suits. The Reverend allowed that it suited. Esther looked up at Levi and said, "Lo, only for him. You never asked me." "I'm asking." "Then yes." Mrs. Purcell stood holding her letter, which had gone from evidence to scrap paper inside of 2 minutes, and folded it wrong twice, and said something about only wishing matters honest, and found that the congregation had turned, all of it at once, the way a field of sunflowers turns, and left her facing backs. What happened to Mrs. Purcell afterward was nothing anybody could have pointed to, and everything she felt. Nobody cut her on the street. Nobody said the word churchyard to her face. But the Ladies' Aid, which had met in the parsonage parlor for 11 years, voted in January to meet at the Beecham place instead, on account of the stove drawing better, and no match in Sage Bluff was ever again submitted to her judgment, and the story of what she had tried and how it had gone traveled to Pine Bluffs and Chugwater ahead of the thaw, wearing less and less of her side of it the farther it went. The gray cloak with the rabbit trim went east on the Tuesday mail. Wrapped inside it, against the cold, went a letter with no reproach in it anywhere, and the receipt for their mother's vinegar pie, which Sylvie had never once managed and had always loved. Esther posted it herself and stood a minute at the window of the post office, watching the sack go into the express car, and then she bought a nickel's worth of horehound for Georgie and drove home. And whatever she left on that eastbound train, she did not go back for it. In the third week of January, the grip came through the valley and took Mrs. Purcell down hard, with the Reverend snowed in at a funeral in Pine Bluffs and no daughter nearer than Omaha. It was Esther who came, with the same kettle and the same steady hands, and sat up 2 nights running in the parsonage while the fever burned and broke. Neither woman spoke one word of the churchyard, then or ever. But at the door, leaving on the third morning, Esther felt her wrist taken and held a moment in a grip with no strength left in it, and she looked back, and Mrs. Purcell said, "You stitch a straight seam, Esther Tabor." From that particular woman, in that particular county, it amounted to a psalm. When the Tullises carried Jane to the font in the spring, the Reverend read out her full name, Jane Esther Tullis, and looked up and smiled before he could catch himself, and half the church turned around to find Esther in the Stroud pew with her ears gone red in exactly the way Georgie's did. And one Friday in March a letter came unbidden from old Dr. Kellum of Winterset, addressed to Mr. L. Stroud, which Levi read at the table and passed across without a word. Half this county was nursed in Rufus Tabor's house. It said, "By the daughter who stayed. You have got the better of the bargain, sir, and I expect that by now you know it." An answer came west from Davenport in April. 2 lines in the old slapdash hand. No apology in it, and no meanness either, which with Sylvie had always amounted to the same weather. The cloak fit, the pie had scorched, and at the bottom, in place of any tenderness she could not manage, she had written the truest thing she knew. "I always did say you were the one with the words." They were married the Saturday after Christmas in the frame church, with the stove roaring and the whole creek in its winter best. The Tullises and the Beechams, and every hand from every outfit between town and the mountains, and Georgie standing up beside his brother with his hair watered down flat, and Pilot shut in the wagon shed at home, an arrangement the dog had made his opinions known about since breakfast. Esther was married in her own gray wool, with a green ribbon in her hair that Georgie had bought with his trapline money, and presented to her that morning with the terrible solemnity of a boy handing over everything he had. She wore no veil and carried no flowers, there being none to carry in that country in December, and nobody who stood in the church that morning ever once described her as plain. Mrs. Beecham gave them her own second-best rocker, delivered by 2 grandsons who would not take coffee for their trouble, and the Tullises brought a ham nearly the size of Georgie, and when the Reverend asked whether Esther Tabor would take this man, the yes came back so prompt and so level that a ripple of laughter went down the pews. And Levi Stroud, who had not been seen to smile in church in the living memory of that congregation, smiled. They drove home in the blue end of the afternoon, with the snow starting again, fine and dry. In the front room, under the south window, stood a thing that had not been there when they left. A small oak writing desk, freighted up from Cheyenne in the wagon of a sworn-to-secrecy Ray Tullis, with a ream of paper in the drawer, a new bottle of ink, and the cedar box of letters in blue string set square in the middle of it. Esther stood looking at it with her hand at her mouth. "The letters ought not have to stop," Levi said, "just because the distance did." That night, with Levi out seeing to the stock one last time, and Georgie asleep with the dog across his feet in open defiance of standing orders. Esther lit the lamp on the new desk and took out a sheet and sat a moment listening to the house. It had the sound, she thought, of a sickness finally sleeping. The sound of a thing afraid to believe itself, and believing anyway. Then she dipped the pen and wrote, "Dear Sylvie, you will want to know how everything came out." She wrote a long while, the plain truth of all of it, the platform, and the churchyard, and the green ribbon, and the desk her own hand rested on while she wrote. And at the bottom of the page, for the first time in any letter that had ever left that country for Iowa, she signed her own name. Then she sat looking at it, while the snow came down soft on the roof of the house she had been sent to by mistake, and belonged to now by every truer measure there was. The lamp burned in that window a long time. Out on the porch, stamping the snow off his boots, Levi Stroud saw it shining on the new drifts, and stood a while in the cold, in no hurry at all, a man with no complaints worth mentioning. And then he went in to his wife and shut the door soft behind him. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.